Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, April 6th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. As the week begins, we're taking a first look at the President's 2027 budget, starting with the headlines and then focusing on what they tell us about federal resources and capacity. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the budget landed on Capitol Hill last week, but left plenty of unanswered questions. We'll take a closer look at how Congress is navigating the budget moment. Plus, year after year, the same financial weaknesses keep showing up in the government's books. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The odds are not in federal employees' favor for getting a pay raise next year. The White House's budget request does not include any mention of a 2027 pay raise for civilian workers. That's in contrast with a proposed raise of up to 7% for military members. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman joins me now with more detail. Drew, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
The president's 2027 budget hit the Hill last Friday. I know you've been studying it. What's in or not in the budget proposal for the federal civilian workforce?
The most important thing here for civilian federal employees, if they're looking for any context clues on their pay raise prospects for next year here, is what's not mentioned in the budget request. There is no money set aside, nothing ever mentioned about a civilian federal employee pay raise next year. And we know that it's missing in part with the context of this being included for military members, where they're going to see roughly a 5 to 7% raise if that budget request becomes enacted. And it was confirmed by an Office of Management and Budget spokesperson that no civilian pay raise is being included in the budget request. That doesn't necessarily mean that federal employees won't get a pay raise next year, but it certainly slims their chances of seeing that salary increase. And just for context, federal employees saw their smallest pay raise, annual pay raise this year with 1% for 2026. That's the smallest since 2021. So in the last 5 years, some federal employees, those in law enforcement positions and military members, got a larger 3.8% pay raise next year. So that's kind of where we sit today with all of this.
What normally comes next in the pay raise process?
There's a lot of time for things to change, potentially. Nothing is necessarily impossible here. The next steps are generally that the president will have an alternative pay plan, most likely by the end of August. This happens every year across both Republican and Democratic administrations. Presidents issue what's called an alternative pay plan for a federal pay raise, and this is effectively to avoid what would be a default to a much larger 20% plus pay raise. Normally, presidents go with just a couple of percentage points for the annual increase. That's exactly what we saw happen last year, where there was no civilian pay raise mentioned in the budget request. And then President Trump, at the end of August, issued his pay plan of 1% for most civilian employees, and then exceptions being made for law enforcement personnel again. There's also still time for Congress to potentially intervene on this topic. You know, this doesn't often come up in annual appropriations, but because they are the ultimate deciders on appropriations for agencies, it's possible they could choose some sort of alternative plan themselves that could make its way into annual spending legislation. There's also the FAIR Act being proposed from House Democrats, where they're looking for a 4.1% federal pay raise next year. That's probably not as likely to occur. But all this being said, nothing is truly going to be made final until most likely December, when we'll see a potential executive order from the president on this.
That's really helpful in walking through all of that process. As you were reviewing the document, what else struck you? What else stood out?
Well, one thing that does seem to be a trend here is, as we know, there's a large military budget being proposed. It's the largest in decades that's coming from the Trump administration here. And that sort of disparity, when you take it in the context of also there being a general 10% cut to civilian agencies for the next fiscal year, that trend where you have increased military spending, decreased civilian spending being proposed, that seems to align generally as well with what we're seeing for the pay raise prospects, where you have a large pay raise coming for military members and nothing being said on the civilian side. I did find that trend interesting throughout the budget request here as well.
And Drew, you mentioned that 10% reduction on the civilian agency side of the budget. Does the budget say anything about future plans for federal employee staffing levels?
It does speak somewhat to the Trump administration's push for the last 14 or so months to downsize the federal workforce. They wrote in the budget request that they have made significant progress with more than 300,000 federal employees leaving their jobs in 2025, seeing even more leave their jobs in the early months of 2026 as well. So the White House is, pointing to that being a continued priority, although we don't necessarily know the details of perhaps how much further they're going to reduce staffing, whether some agencies might turn around and start hiring, which we've seen a bit of a trend on as well. So more of those details are yet to be made clear, but we've seen some data from the budget request shows the staffing level decreases across most agencies between 2024 to 2025. There's also some estimates of agency headcounts for 2026 and into 2027. Those include staffing increases at some agencies like Department of Justice, Veterans Affairs, DHS had some staffing increases as well. But even if agencies did go on that projected trend there, it's still going to, it seems, largely remain below 2024 staffing levels at the very least.
Well, this is really the opening act of this play, so we'll wait to see how all of those discussions play out. That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the president's budget landed on Capitol Hill last week, but left plenty of unanswered questions. We'll take a closer look at how Congress is navigating the budget moment. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The president's budget proposal sets the stage, but much of the action is happening elsewhere on Capitol Hill. We begin with a look at how lawmakers are handling overlapping funding challenges and what might come next with Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me.
You bet.
All right, not like there's not a lot of news, even though it's recess. The president's budget for 2027 hit the Hill on Friday. Give us a quick walk through the headlines.
Well, lawmakers and their staff members are poring over this right now, and it is a huge proposed budget, especially, as you know, in connection with defense. $1.5 trillion proposed by the president. This is the largest by far in decades, going all the way back to the Reagan administration. And what's interesting about it is that this is actually more than was proposed for last year's budget, which a lot of people thought that was a huge defense budget. And then, of course, there's still the pending matter of whether or not the president is going to seek up to $200 billion in additional funding in connection with Iran. So a lot of things will revolve, of course, around this Pentagon request. And a lot of this document came together really from Budget Director Russ Vought. So some people are a little bit surprised that it is high as it is because he is largely a budget hawk, but it does reflect, as always, the proposals, the priorities, I should say, of the president, that this is going to be a big push for more enforcement in connection with enforcement as well, and then a 10% cut for many of the domestic programs. That includes a lot of the energy renewal programs, housing programs, and of course you can bet that Democrats are going to push, and they already have said they are going to push really hard against these type of cuts. And then also related to cuts, there's going to be pressure from conservative Republicans, particularly in the House, to offset this large amount of spending on the defense side, on the domestic side. So you can see that there's potentially a huge clash here coming in connection with Congress, as if we haven't had enough of one already.
Mitchell, this budget comes on top of lots of other resourcing questions, like the Department of Homeland Security, which is still in a funding standoff. What is going on there?
Well, this is a dizzying game of ping pong within the Republican Party, as you know. The fact that the Senate came back early last week and actually essentially dismissed the House budget that had been passed after the Senate originally passed its bill and then came back to what the Senate wanted initially, which is, of course, to fund everything within DHS except for immigration enforcement and border patrol. And now it's kind of in a stuck position, if you will, because the House has indicated they are not going to come back this week. A lot of grumbling from House conservatives, as well as some more moderate Republicans last week, that they just don't want to be forced to deal with this Senate bill. They don't think that it reflects a lot of the things that they have been pushing for really hard, which, of course, is ICE enforcement and Border Patrol money. So I think we're going to be in a suspended animation during this week until they get back the following Monday, and then we'll see when the rubber hits the road what they are actually going to do. Now, of course, the president eased some of the pain potentially with that announcement last week that he's going to fund all of DHS, which is unprecedented that the White House would actually say that it is going to fund an agency that funds so many different programs on its own. Now, of course, it has all the additional funding from the big, beautiful bill that was passed last year, but that only goes so far. And I think you're going to get into the next week a real battle over how is budget reconciliation going to take place.
I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Well, Mitchell, let's move to the reconciliation issue. It is the most Rube Goldberg approach I can think of to fund the federal government. But there's been a lot of talk about what might be in it, how it might proceed, one or two. What are you hearing about those plans?
Right. There's actually a possibility that there could be two reconciliation bills. So one of them would be the one that the House conservatives want initially. And in fact, that's why they are not moving on the overall DHS bill, because they want assurances that there will be more money for ICE enforcement, that there will be more money for the Border Patrol. And so they actually argue that that should be done first. That is not the way the Senate wants it done. So there's already a battle right there over whether or not what the timing of that is going to be. And then there has even been talk of another reconciliation bill that House Speaker Mike Johnson floated in a meeting with lawmakers last week on the Republican side, which would include kind of a grab bag of all these different priorities that House Republicans and other Republicans have in connection with national voter ID, that $200 billion that I mentioned in connection with the Pentagon, and a variety of other ideas that they have. There is a lot of skepticism, frankly, that second one will take place. But there's no doubt that the House Republicans are going to hold pretty firm on this idea that they are going to get some type of reconciliation bill moving forward. So that's kind of where we are right now.
There's just not that many congressional work days between now and the midterms. Is there even a chance that they could get all of that done?
No, and that's why I think there's so much skepticism about a second reconciliation bill. There just isn't time. And in fact, even the first reconciliation bill, there are a lot of Republicans as well as many Democrats that are skeptical that that can take place. So, yeah, you're right. Even though the president has given them a deadline and said, look, we have to fund DHS by June 1st with all these breaks and days off. And then with the midterms, as you mentioned, with all the time off that lawmakers are going to have for campaigning, there just isn't a lot of work days legislatively that this is happening. And then the fact that the Senate came back early last week and had this early morning session, which is very rare at like 7 in the morning. And then the House just kind of thumbed its nose and said, no, we'll deal with it when we come back on the 13th of April. That just shows you that all these days just get kind of squeezed out. And before you know it, we're well into the summer and then we're into the fall campaign season. So you're right. There isn't a lot of time to get all of this done.
Mitchell, when you think about all the things we're talking about here, a budget proposal that's already months late, an entire agency that's not funded, a massive conversation about reconciliation, what implications do you see for a normal budget process? Maybe we haven't had a normal budget process in a long time, but we're supposed to have one. What's the prognosis?
Right. I think there is really a lot of worrying, frankly, here, especially among the longtime appropriators on the Senate side as well as on the House side, that in many ways the appropriations process is broken. If you have one party, say in this case, the Republicans, just demanding that we are only going to take this on our own, that we are only going to do ICE and we are only going to do border protection, and that's our priority. And then you shut out the Democrats in any form of appropriating for those agencies. And then in turn, if you have the Democrats, if they come into power and do the same thing, now, of course, there was limited budget reconciliation under the Biden administration, but that was actually after the money had been all appropriated. And then they wanted to add money, for example, for IRS upgrades and enforcement. So what you have is the potential for an appropriations process that is really broken down into this highly partisan situation where each party just decides, oh, well, we only want to fund these agencies, or we only want to fund these other agencies. And I think there is a big danger there as we move forward, that while it can be done, periodically, budget reconciliation was not something that was just considered something to do very regularly. It was almost esoteric at one point, where they would go to the parliamentarian and ask all these questions. And now I think it's becoming a little bit too de rigueur, if you will. It's becoming too regular here on the Hill. And that it really worries a lot of people who generally those people who are still left, who want to reach across the aisle and do things traditionally, as you say, to actually take a budget, work across the table and see what we can improve on, and then agree overall, this is what we think as Republicans and Democrats is best for the country.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, it sounds like we're in for a white knuckle ride.
We are, so hang on.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, federal government shutdowns have become routine, but their impact on public safety is not. But first, year after year, the same financial weaknesses keep showing up in the government's books. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Another year, another GAO audit unable to certify the federal government's financial statements. The latest report points to persistent problems that agencies and Congress have struggled to fix, despite targeted improvements in some areas. Joining us to explain what's stuck and what could change is Dawn Simpson from GAO. Ms. Simpson, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. Glad to be here.
GAO has recently released the audit of the federal government's consolidated financial statements for fiscal years 2024 and 25. And once again, GAO has said it was unable to issue an audit opinion on the government's financial statements. For our listeners who don't live in the audit world, what does that actually mean in practical terms?
So it means we were not able to determine whether the amounts presented in the financial statements were reliable in all material respects. The reason being is, not having a sufficient amount of evidence in order to make a conclusion as to the reliability of the amounts.
When we're talking about $7.3 trillion in costs, that's a pretty significant statement in terms of unreliability.
The federal government has not been able to achieve a clean opinion on its financial statements. We've been auditing the financial statements since fiscal year 1997. And we continue to find that there's really three major impediments preventing an opinion on those financial statements. Those three impediments are the financial management problems at the Department of Defense, the accounting for activity between federal entities, and the preparation of the consolidated financial statements.
The Department of Defense says it is really, really serious about getting a clean audit, and they have an audit readiness plan. Are they on track to maybe meet some of these critical shortfalls?
There is a lot of work ongoing at the Department of Defense. They are working towards the mandated date of 2028. There has been progress at the Department of Defense, and one key example of that is with the Marine Corps. They have been able to achieve for now 3 years in a row a clean opinion on their financial statements.
The report highlights some long-standing material weaknesses that underlie those three major impediments that you just identified. What are the biggest problem areas that continue to keep the government from being auditable?
There are several material weaknesses that contribute to our disclaimer of opinion, and those are in the categories of on the asset side with the property and equipment and inventory and supplies, also with loans receivables and loan guarantees, and then moving on to some of the environmental and disposal liabilities, your commitments and contingencies, as well as then to your net cost. Those are some of the key line item areas where there are control deficiencies.
Don, there's a lot of work to do to get all of the systems working to actually create a clean audit. But when these weaknesses persist year after year, what are the real consequences? How does it affect decision making and oversight and public trust?
So that is the key. You can get to a clean opinion on your financial statements and still have material weaknesses in control. That's not the case with the weaknesses in the controls right now are such at a point that they actually contribute to not being able to get to a clean opinion. But it is possible to have reliable numbers at a single point in time on your financial statements, but still have then significant problems with your controls and your processes. But the goal is then to have the processes and controls that function effectively so that then you have reliable data throughout the year, not just at that single point in time. And that's really the goal of improving federal financial management in the federal government, is getting to a point where you have reliable financial data throughout the year from which managers can use to make decisions.
I'm speaking with Dawn Simpson. She's a director of the Financial Management and Assurances Issues Team at GAO. Ms. Simpson, let's take a step back. We have not had much success in getting Congress to deliver budgets, appropriations on time for decades. Now we have consistent perpetual problems in financial reporting. When you put all those together, what does that tell you at GAO about how well our systems are operating and how well we know exactly what we need to spend and what we need to spend it on?
And a key part of our work at GAO and what you'll see in looking at the financial report of the U.S. government is really looking at the long term. And when you look at that and you see there's a specific financial statement that is required by federal accounting standards that's prepared. It's the Statement of Long-Term Fiscal Projections. And when you look at that and the other sustainability financial statements and you analyze those, I mean, you see that the federal government is on an unsustainable long-term fiscal path. And what that means is to be unsustainable means that your debt is growing faster than your economy. And so you're doing a calculation between your debt to your gross domestic product, or GDP. And when that number is increasing, then you're on an unsustainable fiscal path. And that is what has been the situation for many, many years now. And so that is where the financial report discusses the unsustainable fiscal path, and our work and our audit report address that issue as well. And then GAO also prepares a separate report and on an annual basis that we've done for about 10 years now, called The Nation's Fiscal Health, that really goes into more details about the unsustainable fiscal path.
Another key piece of GAO's work is the examination you all do of improper payments and waste, fraud, and abuse. Given what you've just described in terms of material weaknesses across the federal agencies in terms of financial reporting, how are those two things connected? Can you get good estimates of waste, fraud, and abuse and improper payments when the systems are not giving you good data?
It's interesting. The whole issue with improper payments was actually identified because of the discipline of the financial statement audits. And that being then a government-wide problem was, came about through the financial audits. And so, that discipline can, by improving controls, if you've got the processes and the controls, then that should then help in the areas of improper payments and fraud. And so that discipline will continue to, help in those areas.
GAO does note in this audit that some progress is being made. So let's flip over to the more optimistic side of the report. Where are you seeing progress?
So as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Defense with Marine Corps, that was a key example of progress. In 2023, they achieved, a clean opinion. They're the first military service to be able to do that. And they've been able to maintain it now for 24 and 2025. Another key example this year was the Department of Education, who had a disclaimer for the last 3 years. They did a balance sheet only audit, but they were able to get to a clean opinion on their balance sheet. The agencies that are, other than the Department of Defense, the other agencies that are experiencing financial management challenges right now, all of them have in the past achieved a clean opinion. So they have the processes, the controls. They know what to do. It's just getting over the financial management challenges that they're experiencing right now.
As you look ahead, what does Congress need to do to support agencies in their work to achieve a clean audit?
We have suggested to Congress to develop a strategy to to be able to place the government on a sustainable fiscal path. And so that is one key area, is really addressing the unsustainable long-term fiscal path.
Do agencies need more funding to invest in new financial management systems?
Some work we did a few years ago, the Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990 has been around now over 30 years. And we took a look back at seeing, what progress had happened since that landmark legislation was passed compared to, now, and also the challenges that still exist. And there has been a lot of progress in federal financial management over the past 30 plus years, but there's still a lot of challenges to get to that point of having the reliable data at any point in time. And one of the areas that we discussed in that report are the financial management systems, and having the systems that work effectively to be able to have the financial reporting processes that are necessary.
I've been speaking with Dawn Simpson. She is a director on the Financial Management and Assurance Issues team at GAO. Thanks so much for walking us through this really important report.
Thank you. And like I said, glad to have been here.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, federal government shutdowns have become routine, but their impact on public safety is not. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Shutdown showdowns are no longer rare events, and law enforcement leaders say that recurring uncertainty creates real risks for public safety agencies that rely on continuity and trust. The National Police Association is throwing its support behind the Eliminate Shutdowns Act as a way to break that cycle. Joining me to discuss why predictability matters so much for policing and public safety operations is spokesperson for the National Police Association, Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith. Sergeant Smith, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
So great to be with you.
The National Police Association is supporting the Eliminate Shutdowns Act that was introduced by Senator Wyden of Wisconsin, arguing that government shutdowns put public safety at risk. So from a law enforcement perspective, what actually happens on the ground when the federal government shuts down?
Well, I think this is something that most people don't take a look at because they think a federal shutdown only affects federal employees and federal operations. But what happens very often is that state and local law enforcement have to step in to assist their federal partners who, may not have enough staffing. The TSA is a great example of that. We also have to look at the funding of the DHS. And when DHS isn't fully operational because it's not fully funded, then the local, state, county law enforcement officer is on the front lines of that war on terror right here in the United States, as we have been seeing in the last month.
Let's follow that thread for a minute. As we're in current combat operations in the Middle East, are you seeing increased threats that have local police forces worried?
Absolutely. We saw that the Austin, Texas Police Department had to respond to a terrorist-involved shooting and eliminate that shooter. We've seen multiple other situations in Michigan and I believe North Carolina. And this is something that local law enforcement, we've had a heightened alert since 9/11/01 anyway, and we're kind of back to that 9/12/01 mentality, if you will, where we have got to really be those frontline boots on the ground in the war against terror here in the United States. Because again, we have to remember that 5 years ago, our borders were thrown wide open. We have literally millions of people here in the United States that remain unidentified. We don't know who they are. We don't know who they are affiliated with. And there is terror cell after terror cell around this nation. And when federal law enforcement operations are interrupted, that endangers everyone.
Let's talk a little bit more about the impacts of the DHS shutdown. DHS has responsibility to provide warnings about cyber threats, about other sorts of physical threats and terror attacks. What are you seeing as a result of perhaps the reduction in that capacity during shutdown?
Well, I've got to say that federal law enforcement is very bravely continuing to do their job despite this government shutdown. But it is very difficult from an investigatory standpoint to continue to put resources on the ground when you are dealing with things like, cyber investigations, terror cell investigations. And we are seeing that when law enforcement operations are politicized, they are interrupted. And federal law enforcement is already stretched very thin, as is state and local law enforcement. And so when you have a lack of resources, you have a thinning of resources, then again, that makes everyone less safe. Let's not forget that because of what we saw in 2020 and beyond, this literal war on cops and the vilification of the American law enforcement officer, you saw a lot of people leave this profession. So when we look at our law enforcement agencies, 9 out of every 10 police departments are still short-staffed. And while the numbers are slowly increasing, state, local, and federal as well, we're still a long way from where we need to be fully staffed, fully operational.
I'm speaking with Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith. She is the spokesperson for the National Police Association. So, Betsy, shutdowns are sadly becoming a more recurrent fact of life. Might be one thing if you just had one and you could move on from it, but how do local police experience the repeated impact of federal shutdowns? What's breaking? What's missing?
Well, every time the federal government shuts down, that shutdown immediately trickles down to the state and local level. Let's take a look at the TSA right now. What happens because we have these long TSA lines at certain airports around the nation? Those lines end up clogging up traffic, making moving around the airports and the roadways around them very difficult. Who deals with that? It's not the TSA, and it's not, ICE or anyone else that federally that is there to help, that's going to be out directing traffic, trying to help people park and all of that. It's going to be the local law enforcement. And when tensions are high and we see people acting out in the airports, again, who deals with that? It's either the local city or county police department, the municipal airport police department. So when you see that the TSA lines, the raising of temperatures and things like that, again, it's the locals who have to deal with that through no fault of their own. And that leads to its own frustration. We also have to look at how local law enforcement are involved with federal law enforcement in various task force situations. And that leads to basically a shutdown of those types of activities. For example, I was on a federally run task force back in the day when it came to narcotics. When the federal law enforcement officers and their funding had to pull out of that task force, of course, that affected not just us, the officers, but it affects that war on drugs, that war on sex trafficking, that war on terrorism, whatever that task force is dealing with. And again, a lot of people don't know that these federal, state, local task forces are a huge part of our law enforcement infrastructure and our success in bringing the crime rate down.
Let's go back to the Eliminate Shutdowns Act for a minute, because critics argue that eliminating shutdowns could reduce Congress's leverage in budget negotiations. The flip side of that, and I'd like you to respond, is the idea that public safety shouldn't be used as leverage in the first place.
Public safety should not be political. This should not be a right or a left issue. And our elected officials, one of their biggest jobs and one of the things that we elect them to do is to keep us, the American people, safe. So what this act would do was just provide automatic continuing appropriations when it comes to public safety issues and nothing else. So we unfortunately, and again, you can go back to 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 years when it comes down to these shutdowns, if this is something that anyone has studied, and you can see that when we go from the past up to the current situation that we're in, public safety has been used more and more by our politicians to sort of squeeze the public and squeeze other politicians to pass appropriation bills, the continuing resolution. And it's obscene, quite frankly. This is I want everybody to think about, the municipality that you live in. What if your city council members and your mayor decided to say, you know what, we're going to shut down the police department until we can agree politically? That's insane. And everybody thinks that's insane. But that's exactly what's happening at the federal level. And it impacts national security and it impacts your security on a local level as well.
I've been speaking with Sergeant Betsy Brantner-Smith. She's the spokesperson for the National Police Association. Thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for your personal police service.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, April 6th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. As the week begins, we're taking a first look at the President's 2027 budget, starting with the headlines and then focusing on what they tell us about federal resources and capacity. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the budget landed on Capitol Hill last week, but left plenty of unanswered questions. We'll take a closer look at how Congress is navigating this budget moment. Plus, year after year, the same financial weaknesses keep showing up in the government's books. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The White House is proposing a significant military pay raise as part of its massive $1.5 trillion defense budget request. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me today with more. Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
Let's talk about the defense part of this 2027 budget and start with military pay. What is the White House proposing there?
Yeah, so the White House has proposed kind of a tiered military pay raise. Junior enlisted service members would see the largest increase under this plan. So troops ranked E5 and below would see a 7% increase. More senior enlisted members and officers, that would be E6 through O3, would get a 6% pay raise. And then finally, officers in the ranks of O4 and higher would get a 5% pay raise.
That's a really different approach. How does that compare to prior military pay raises?
Yeah, definitely. Well, if lawmakers agree with this vision and if they pass it into law, this would exceed recent pay raises for military personnel. Over the last couple of years, that would be 2020 and on, military pay raises have ranged from 3% to 5.2%. In 2025, however, junior enlisted service members received a historic 14.5% pay raise. That's the year when lawmakers focused on various quality of life issues, and they approved an additional 10% pay raise for junior enlisted service members on top of that 4.5% across the board pay raise that everyone else received. The White House said, and I quote, "This enduring investment far above the standard annual military pay raise builds on the president's recruiting and retention success."
Well, let's zoom back out to the total defense budget, $1.5 trillion. It's over a 44% increase. How is the administration justifying the defense budget of that size?
Yeah, in the budget documents, the White House said this budget request, and I quote, recognizes the current global threat environment and restores the readiness and lethality of our forces. They described this budget as historic for its investments in the administration's priorities, such as Golden Dome, the Missile Defense Initiative, and investment in what they call Trump's Golden Fleet. But Trump has been teasing the 1.5 trillion budget for quite a while. It started in January, and at the time, he said that the revenue being brought in by the tariffs would be sufficient to cover increased military spending. Now, of course, in February, the Supreme Court ruled that many of the president's tariffs, especially those imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, were illegal. But the proposed increase comes as the U.S. is spending billions of dollars on the war in Iran. The U.S. and Israel began striking the country on February 28th. Although it looks like the budget doesn't include funding to finance that war, the White House is going to ask Congress for a supplemental spending package to cover those costs. I also wanted to put this budget into perspective. Todd Harrison from the American Enterprise Institute said that this would be the highest level of funding for defense in U.S. history, surpassing even the peak funding during World War II. And that peak funding was $1.2 trillion in today's dollars. Trump also recently said that the federal government needs to focus on military spending rather than various federal safety net programs. Here's President Trump.
We're fighting wars. We can't take care of daycare. You got to let a state take care of daycare, and they should pay for it, too. They should pay. They have to raise their taxes, but they should pay for it. And we could lower our taxes a little bit to them to make up, but it's not possible for us to take care of daycare. Medicaid, Medicare, all these individual things, they can do it on a state basis. You can't do it on a federal. We have to take care of one thing, military protection. We have to guard the country.
Anastasia, what have you heard from lawmakers so far on this defense budget?
We have the Senate and House Armed Services Committee's chairman, Roger Wicker, and Mike Rogers. They said that they're committed to passing this budget into law. However, they did not specify how exactly they will get to that $1.5 trillion figure, or whether they will pursue another reconciliation bill, which is what the White House wants Republicans to do. They want Republicans to pursue the same strategy as last year and have a reconciliation bill worth of $350 billion. In the budget documents, they said, and I quote, "The administration has successfully shifted the paradigm by including increase to defense spending in a reconciliation bill passed with only Republican votes, and that the strategy has proven to be a success, and that the administration will continue to deploy it in this year's budget." It's not clear if Trump will have enough support within his own party, given this last year's multi-trillion-dollar spending package. Meanwhile, Democrats oppose the budget of this size. The vice chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, for example, said the budget proposal is bleak and unacceptable, and that the only responsible thing to do with this budget is to toss it in the trash.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for joining us.
Definitely. Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from CBS News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.